Assalamu alaikum and good day, colleagues, and welcome to this panel organized by the International Congress of Mathematicians. The title for today's panel is Balance Between Education in Classroom and Remote Online Teaching. As a panel, we are very grateful to the ICM for giving us, the mathematics educators, an opportunity to engage with the mathematics education community. I will let the panel members introduce themselves. I am Anjum Halai. I'm a professor of mathematics education at the Aga Khan University in Pakistan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kyunghwa Lee from South Korea. I would like to begin by thanking organizing committee to give me this opportunity to share my experiences and thoughts on balancing between in-person classroom teaching and remote online education. The title of my talk is Blending Affordances and Opportunities in the Digital Era, the Context of K-12 Math Education in South Korea. The unexpected spread of COVID-19 brought about great difficulties for Korean schools, just as in many other countries. Fortunately, Korea was well equipped for the sudden transition to online education. According to a survey by Ministry of Science and ICT, almost all Korean households and almost all Korean adolescents have internet access. At the beginning of the pandemic, Ministry of Education quickly expanded public infrastructure, developed a system to put together previously developed online learning systems such as EBS, linked and expanded online learning resources. As a result, 98.9% of all Korean K-12 students participated in online learning during the pandemic. Let's take a close look at the real situation. According to MOE survey on the platforms that teachers most frequently use for their classes, about 67% of teachers use the two main e-learning platforms that were previously developed by the government. About 33% of teachers mostly depend on domestic or global private platforms, saying these are more convenient in a mobile setting. In the meantime, a few issues come to the surface. That is, teachers tended to use ready-made contents instead of designing their own lessons for remote online teaching. Another issue is that many teachers didn't try to blend physical classroom teaching and remote online education, since they hardly connect student learning in the two different settings. To understand what would be the reason behind those issues and explore appropriate pedagogy, I try to have a closer look at the real situation by conducting semi-structured interviews with a few teachers and students who are in grade 5, 7, 9, and 11. I tried to interview teachers and students with various backgrounds, teachers aged from early 30s to mid-50s, and have 6 years to 30 years of teaching experiences. Students also have various academic, affective, and sociocultural backgrounds. Among 10 interview questions, I would like to focus on the experienced challenges and benefits from their online mathematics teaching and learning, and whether they want to maintain remote online education for their mathematics teaching and learning in the post-COVID era. Here are the challenges most frequently mentioned: lack of quality contents and new pedagogy for online teaching, lack of professional capacity to integrate digital world into their mathematics teaching and to support students emotionally as well as cognitively, lack of capacity to deal with dehumanization and desocialization phenomena, inequity and inequality in mathematics learning driven by digital divide is also perceived serious. And teachers said that many students are losing their competence to learn mathematics and declining their interest in mathematics. Interestingly, advantages and challenges that the students described are like the two sides of one coin. As grade 11 students mentioned, rich learning environment is helpful to widen his scope of learning and harmful at the same time, since students can't manage their learning within limited time and often distracted by those fancy divergent contents. Mathematical communication in online classes have both sides too. On the one hand, it is fun and easy for students in virtue of the freedom of language use for convenience in online setting, and on the other hand, it is problematic when they move to the symbolic system. Students also mentioned about feeling of independence and isolation. And students have conflicting opinions on interaction with their mathematics teachers. Some found various ways of exchanging messages. The others don't feel easy to represent their thoughts in front of camera. E-assessment is another issue that students mentioned as convenient or inconvenient. If face-to-face classes and remote online classes are to be properly mixed, what proportion would participants hope to balance between them? Interestingly, there are a few patterns that I need to further explore. First, the older the teacher's age, the more cautious they are about remote online education. Boys are relatively more positive about online learning environment. The higher the student's grade, the more they hoped for online classes. I'm going to briefly introduce a couple of case studies I have conducted with my students seeking appropriate lesson design during the pandemic. This study is to clarify the meaning and impact of maintaining intra and interaction in offline and online classes. One of the major findings is that students were observed to continue indeterminate act of assembling various kinds of agencies while maintaining intra and interaction in both mathematics learning environments. Second study was conducted during the lockdown period. Our instructional design was based on the semiotic activity theory elaborated by Bush and Bacaloni-Frank, and we explored how various gestures, images, behaviors, such as crossing their arms and dragging points, and various figures that students create enhance students' distance semiotic activities. One important finding is that teachers mirroring and orchestrating students' multimodal semiotic bundles could effectively engage students in the distance semiotic activity. Third study is about content-based online mentoring. A group of mathematics teachers and students in the high school attached to my university participated in the study as mentors and mentees. As you can see from the diagram, mentoring begins with a teacher making a diagnosis of a student's math learning and his or her background, such as career aspiration. Then, teacher assigns customized problems using an application for each student. Third, student solves the assigned problem and submit what he or she worked on it with all the records of trials, errors, thoughts, and questions. Then teacher gives feedback not only about what students tried, but also about what they should have done. Giving emotional support is also an important characteristic of the mentoring process. The program was particularly effective for low-achieving students. Prior to COVID-19 crisis, Korean math teachers have not given much attention to e-learning or distance learning. Now we have a new paradigm for K-12 math education, which is related to appropriate blending various educational affordances and opportunities. I don't believe there is one single way of blending different educational settings or environments. Blending could and should be shaped according to the needs of students from various backgrounds, could and should be based on interactive learning material with effective pedagogical strategies, and of course, it requires infrastructure, ICT support, and building mathematics teachers' professional competence. Thank you for your kind attention.
Hello everyone, greetings from Brazil. I'm Marcelo Borba from São Paulo State University, Unesp, okay? The southern part of the country. So it's my pleasure to be here, a math educator talking to mathematicians, and we do need to work together for many problems, such as this big one for this panel. I'm going to talk a little bit about videos in mathematics education, and also about the online remote teaching, right? This all this problem we had. So one of the goals of education, one of the goals of mathematics education is to reduce inequality. Social inequality is a problem way before the pandemic, but the pandemic made this social inequality even more intense. And do you know what? Many people like Engelbrecht from South Africa and myself, we have written about how we had to all of a sudden start a pedagogue. Because one thing is to have experience in research like I do, or in developing an online mathematics course, but with planning, not from people who sometimes are at different places. And we do had one problem. When we don't have planning, the notion of domestication of media became even more important. Why? What's domestication of media? Is to use the media in the way I used to use the other media. So use the internet the same way I'm using a regular blackboard. So this is part of the problems that we have. In Brazil, many people do not pay attention to the research that math educators have in how to teach online. A lot of the researchers, or like policymakers, they try to look at test results. So this was a problem. And we have to try to have not only domesticated ways, but creative ones. And this is very important. Why is it important? Because this generation who is attending university or attending school, they do have a different culture than mine. They even have special names here in Brazil. So I'm from the other, millennium, okay? And they are from this millennium, and that's how they somehow create this barrier. So it's important that we try to go beyond the domestication, the domesticated use of the media. For instance, we can just say and use the internet to transmit a list of calculus or analysis, depends how you call it, or linear algebra, whatever you want. But the main thing is that you're just going to be transmitting that and not using maybe creative ways that this media, the computer, and somehow can add and transform to paper and pencil. In schools in Brazil, we had many who just send papers, literally send papers. And why? Well, because they don't have access to the internet, some schools, and when the school does, many of the students don't. So that's one problem that you should be aware, and that's a big thing of the remote online teaching. So we can have, however, creative ways of using these media. So this would be a non-domesticated way. I'm using, computers. I'm using the big problem of the pandemic and how the pandemic somehow, how people can get infected in different red curves in this family of sigmoids, and at the same time, the different derivatives that are represented in the blue curve. So I can use that to discuss why it's important to stay at home, why it was important to stay at home during a good part of 2020 and 2021, so that you would not have an explosion of use of beds in the hospitals. So we can use this to explain to a vast majority of the population, but not here if we're going to be talking about the equations of this and all that. So that's why we can use that to enlarge and to have a mathematics education for all. We must teach more and more exponential function to kids so that they can understand why the rich are getting richer, why the poor are getting poorer, including the pandemic. So it's essential for us to understand that for social equality, but also to understand how the virus, SARS-CoV-2 just go around. So, will this period reduce or increase inequality? We already know that it has increased inequality. The richer got richer during the pandemic, the poor got even more poor, much more people with hunger in Brazil and all that. So it's important now that we have, try to build democracy around the world, and in Brazil, we must have, a math education for all that include different factors that we are not aware of before the pandemic, or we were aware, but not that aware. So we must have equality in the internet access. We must pressure, we must pressure the big companies to have internet for all. So we need to have homes and artifacts that have gained more agents equal to everyone. We cannot have, an education that does not consider that who deals with the education of kids? Home, parents, internet, student, teacher, school, everything else. And why is that important? Because if my kids were at home, if they were in the school age, I would be able to help them much better than the bricklayers in Brazil with little education, or maybe many others without any education whatsoever. So the remote online teaching have brought a lot of pressure on parents to help, and this is a big problem. But if they have always thought that if you want to have a quality maths education to all, if you want to have democracy in Brazil and elsewhere, you cannot have a situation like that. So homes and parents from here can help and can buy tutors, online tutors for their kids during the pandemic in the way that people in the shantytown could not. So this is one way that you should be more and more aware of that. We've been trying to use videos before the pandemic and during the pandemic even more as a way of transforming mathematics education. A mathematics education in which people can somehow make videos, and as they make videos, students and teachers, they learn mathematics and they learn the interaction of mathematics with phenomena such as the pandemic, if you wish. So this is very important, and we have here an example that you might be able to see a little excerpt, but maybe you can just get this address here and watch this video in Portuguese, this funny language, but with subtitles in English. And you can see how advanced mathematics can be done with 12-year-old kids. When you have a good teachers and producing videos about a big social problem in Brazil that happened before the pandemic. In any case, we must ask, is such an equality can achieve mathematics education for all? Yes, we should think the way Paulo Freire does. We should not have, Math education is not able to transform the world, but without math education, it's going to be very hard for us to understand what's going on in the world. And I would like to thank Geraldo Lima. He's on the other side here with his mask filming me here so I can speak a little bit better. Hope to see you around, okay? In the next conference, it's an honor to be a math educator talking here to mathematicians.
Hello and greetings from Mumbai. I'm K. Subramaniam, known as Ravi, from the Homi Bhabha Center for Science Education in Mumbai. I thank the program committee for inviting me to be on this panel, which I consider to be an honor. I will be talking about the balance between classroom and remote teaching in under-resourced contexts. The questions that I'll be asking are, what are the resource constraints for remote online teaching in the Indian context, which is an under-resourced one? What changes did the pandemic-related lockdown bring? And what are the implications for a balance between classroom and remote education? The sources I'll be drawing on, several studies conducted during the pandemic, online conferences of the Mathematics Teachers Association. 2 conferences were held during the pandemic. This gives a platform for teachers' voices, and these recordings of the conferences are available online. Let me give a bit of background. There are over 250 million school students in India. That's over a 250 million. Roughly 70% go to government or government-aided schools, and the remaining to private schools. Most private schools are low fee. That is, the fee they charge is below what the government spends per student. However, inequality is deep-rooted. There are, of course, many well-resourced schools catering to elite sections. Now, what was the experience of remote teaching and learning during the COVID lockdown in India? Here are some figures. Now, this is from a study which is Vyas 2020. And the study was conducted somewhat at the beginning of the lockdown. It's important to compare government and private schools because private schools generally cater to students coming from slightly better off households, although they are not high fee private schools. The majority of them are actually low fee schools. As you can see here, only about 20%, this was based on interviews with parents, only 20% of the parents responded of students going to government schools access some form of remote education, while this figure was 40% for private schools. Now, even among those who accessed education, there were many issues that they faced, with 75% of the parents of government school students reported facing issues, while 84% of the private school students' parents reported issues. These were mainly connectivity issues or not having an appropriate device or enough devices, and also the cost involved in accessing these devices and connectivity. Now, if you look at the modes by which this remote education was delivered, for government schools, it was overwhelmingly instant messaging or WhatsApp, where resources would be sent. This is certainly not synchronous mode of teaching, it's only asynchronous. 75% of the parents reported this. And the other mode was phone calls from the teachers to the students. It was similar to in the private schools, where again, the most dominant mode was WhatsApp or instant messaging, phone calls, YouTube recordings, as well as a few parents reported using online teaching, which is using Zoom, and that's about 22%. That's significant because that's the only form of synchronous teaching that's available. Now, since the lockdown was very extended, in fact, India had the second largest lockdown of almost 82 weeks amongst all countries. So it's expected that some changes would have taken place, and some pressure would have been there to change. And indeed, we see some changes. For example, now before I explain this, some preliminary remarks about this study. This is based on another study by the same group as the one I showed in the earlier slide. The first study was conducted roughly 3 months into the lockdown. The second study was conducted about 15 months later, so almost the end of the lockdown. This was between the second and the third waves of COVID in India. And there was some change. Now, the government school students by then had already shifted to some form of in-person education because it was very difficult for them to access remote education. So the government school data is not included here. There's only a comparison of the private schools before and after, and the samples were also not the same. However, this study was done fairly carefully and reported carefully, and it is also supported by other studies or media reports which are available. So the trends are quite indicative, and we can take them to represent something that actually happened. So if you look at the parents who accessed teaching before in the first study, it was only 40%, and now about 50% accessed remote teaching. And the main modes of the education delivery, the live online classes rose from 22% to 80%. So many more were accessing these modes. However, it does not mean that there were no problems. And WhatsApp was still being used as a supplementary mode of education. The other thing that I'd like to mention is that families went through enormous stress and made enormous efforts to provide education. Some of them hired a tuition teacher, many involvement in some learning activity. They set up a special place in the house or purchased a digital device. Now, I'd like to emphasize this especially because many teachers, even in our conferences, reported that without some parental supervision at home, the students don't engage in the online classes. So this is very essential, and this is not available to most students or to most families. It's only where parents can afford to spend some time monitoring or supervising the participation of their students, particularly young students in primary or middle school, is online teaching even partly successful. Without that, it's very hard to maintain success. So let me summarize. The access to digital modes of education appears to have improved during the pandemic for students studying in private schools, who are generally from better off households. Parents made a great deal of effort towards providing support. And for government schools and teachers, the preferred mode was in-person teaching, and they made special efforts to arrange this. Further, which was not included in the earlier discussion, the teachers improved their skills in using a combination of digital modes. And this was apparent in our conferences, and there was an enthusiastic response from teachers whenever there was a workshop on the use of digital technology, especially remote technologies and so on. Now, what are the implications for blending online and classroom teaching? Now, post the pandemic, as society is built back, some form of blended education is perceived as desirable, sometimes as inevitable. This is because remote online teaching is perceived to have some advantages over classroom teaching, the potential to scale up quality instruction, to facilitate personalized instruction. However, as we have seen, even for traditional pedagogical approaches, some parental supervision is necessary to ensure student engagement. Now, research in mathematics education has shown that teacher-guided peer-to-peer discussion is essential because traditional modes really have rote learning outcomes. And for any meaningful and equitable learning, it's essential to have peer-to-peer discussion, which is guided by teachers. And this is almost impossible to achieve in remote online instruction. Hence, the dominant mode, especially in the primary and middle grades, would need to be classroom teaching, and especially in low-resource contexts. Now, I found there is, of course, technological support for student engagement. There are lots of advances in mathematical software for instruction, and these have been impressive. They've improved student interfaces, enhanced visual and aesthetic quality, and they've incorporated research findings, such as linked multiple representations or embodied learning perspectives. Now, these certainly have the potential to enhance student engagement, even if they're implemented through remote teaching. However, a combination of good technology resources as well as high quality teaching is essential for these impacts. Now, both of these are not available in under-resourced contexts. In fact, a large part of the work of mathematics educators, such as myself in such contexts, is to enhance teachers' capacity, which is very much below need. Now, there's a tendency to view in these contexts technology as a substitute for teachers, which actually amounts to denying equitable education. And hence the oft-heard remark, teachers for the rich and technology for the poor. Now, these are some references, and thank you. Stop here.
Greetings from Tanzania. My name is Veronica Sarungi, and I'll be presenting on balance between education in classroom and remote online teaching, opportunities for improvement. I would like to take this opportunity also to thank the conference organizers for the privilege of being part of this panel discussion. The rapid shift to a school closure and a new mode of learning in 2020 provided great challenges everywhere in the world, including Tanzania, but also moving ahead, opportunities for improvement in building a new future. In Tanzania, the majority of pupils in primary and secondary school are in government schools that have little or no fees. Enrollment in tertiary education is around 64,000 in 2017-2018, which accounts for about 8% of the eligible students who could attend. In March of 2020, there was a rapid shift to school closure, and this lasted comparatively shorter, about 3 months for tertiary and 4 for other levels. The government put in place some forms of mitigation, and this was in the form of radio and TV programs, mainly aimed at the final year of upper secondary that was supposed to have sat for exams in May 2020. However, there was also some limited form of remote online learning, as discussed or used in this presentation, which is synchronous form of teaching. However, this varied widely across levels and also institutions. One of the lessons learned at a personal level while working at a private university that had shifted to remote online learning was that there was multiple levels of access requirements that proved to be a challenge to learners. So first, there was a need to have a platform, which the institution provided. In other schools, this was done through Google Classroom or other free programs. The next level was devices, with some students having to share. Mobile devices proved to be very useful in this context. However, data was a problem for synchronous learning because the cost of connecting was very high. And finally, because of the restrictions of time and space, some students were not able to connect even when the cost of data was offset for them. So there are 3 important lessons that could be derived from the remote online learning based on my own experience teaching remotely, and also through informal discussions with teachers as part of my teacher education work. And the first lesson was the importance of social connections, in that both students and teachers felt that there was a lack of social connections, and the degree to which it was present dependent on how much had already been built before the remote online learning. Another important lesson was pedagogy, in that most teachers replicated rather than built on the elements of technology that could have influenced their teaching. And again, the extent of digital pedagogy that was used was influenced by how teachers had already been familiarized with ICT integration in face-to-face teaching. And perhaps the most important learning was the comfort with technology, with teachers being less comfortable since they are seen as digital immigrants, versus the students who are digital natives and who are familiar with the devices. And so there was an increased collaborative process during the remote online learning, with students being given a greater role, not just in solving technical issues for each other, but also in the classroom. After the move to face-to-face learning, there are some aspirations within the Tanzanian context, and I would like to share 3 of these. The one is that there is an increased emphasis on digital literacy. There is also a move towards meaningful ICT integration. And finally, the need to build or strengthen existing virtual learning environments. And so what is the balance, or what could be the balance? Looking at the context of Tanzania. For primary level, where the access is in no fee paying schools, it would be very important to focus more on building students' personal engagement and interest in mathematics and digital literacy. And so the majority of lessons are better suited for in-person classroom learning. However, this is specific, context specific again, depending on the school's access to online platform and the students' ability to connect. At secondary level, it will be very important to explore how technology could positively change how mathematics is learned, starting in class and also remotely online. It is also very important to leverage on initiatives that already exist, such as content presentation websites, that could then be used or built into remote online learning, for example, through virtual learning environments, again, depending on school infrastructure. The greatest opportunity for integrating remote online learning, in my opportunity, would be at tertiary level, and the faculty would play a key role depending on their willingness to innovate and how much support they're given with technology. And I would like to highlight the unique placement of teacher education programs, especially mathematics teacher educations, in bridging the gap between the digital immigrants and the digital natives. And so while there are challenges, and there were challenges, moving ahead, it is important, in my opinion, to explore how in-person classroom could build the comfort and ability to use technology in a transformative way. Thank you.
Good day, colleagues, and welcome to this panel discussion organized by the ICM Congress. We are very pleased that we are engaging with the community of mathematicians and mathematics educators. The title of the panel that has been given to us today is Balance Between Education in Classrooms and Remote Online Teaching. We have with us 4 panelists, and their videos have already been posted online. And I will now invite each one of the panelists with one key question, but I will request the panelists to also give her name and the name of the institution and country as an introduction. So Huali, I would like to start with you. What can you say about the blend of affordances and opportunities in the digital era in the context of mathematics education in Korea? Huali.
Thank you, Anju. My name is Kyunghwa Lee. I'm working for Seoul National University, South Korea. First of all, I would like to begin by thanking organizing committee to invite me to be a panel. The topic we get was balancing between in-person classroom teaching and online education. You can find 2 different educational settings already there because of the unexpected outbreak of COVID-19. We all were suffered, and we had just sudden transition to online education, whether we expected or whether we wanted. It was the case in Korea that Ministry of Education jumped in, preparing all the infrastructure or resources so that teachers and students can move into the new world of education. Now we are having new normal for education. So we were not happy, but we could have opportunity to see the new world. And we also could see some kind of technological affordances we actually didn't pay attention much before COVID-19. So I tried to explore some kind of affordances and opportunities, although we all were in maybe some kind of chaos. So I tried to find new pedagogical strategies to overcome some kind of difficulties students might face with. For example, students suddenly they just have a new language, new representation system that are familiar to them, but maybe not appropriate for learning mathematics. So they use their language in online setting, but when they move to a symbolic system, they need to find another instrument to communicate using those they never used before. So it also can highlight some kind of opportunity because students can find another path to math using their everyday language. And they also can find many chances to have a close look at other peers' experience, facial expressions, something like that. And online setting itself can give us a lot of opportunity. So, to be short, I can find many different settings and opportunities to be blended. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I was very curious to know that there were new pedagogical strategies that emerged as a result of this. And of course, students and youth are very used to using a shortcut blend of short languages in the digital era. So what you said was that they had to, though some of those practices they had to unlearn because they were in the mathematics classroom.
Yes.
Okay.
Students, okay.
Yes.
Can I explain more about that?
Yes, if you can, briefly.
Yes. Yeah. Prior to COVID-19, teachers and students, they use technology, but differently. They are not that aware of something that is related to learning mathematics. But after COVID-19, teachers and students, they have no other instruments but technology. So
Yes.
they use technology in different aspects, and they also appreciate mathematics to lead all us to this new world, new time.
Very interesting. Thank you. I'll now go to our colleague Marcelo. Marcelo, I looked at your video and I think you were making significant points about domestication of media. Can you elaborate a little bit? First, introduce yourself and then elaborate a little bit on your point of view about domestication of media.
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks, Andrew, for your question. And before I answer, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to be one of the math educators at the Mathematicians Conference. I'm Marcelo Borba from Unesp, the State University of São Paulo in Brazil. And I've been doing research on mathematics education for about 35 years or something like that. And a lot on digital media when it first started. And so at that time, I could see, Angela and colleagues, the idea that maybe the bricklayers in Brazil who were illiterate, they have a mathematics with orality. Our mathematics in school with paper and pencil. And then I just saw that mathematics comes with computers, not internet yet. So it came the idea that, we should, that knowledge is produced in the classroom, and knowledge as institutionalized knowledge is also produced by a collective of humans with media. So different media, different knowledge. And if we do use, for instance, computers or internet in the same way that we use the telephone, comparing to internet, or the paper and pencil, we are somehow domesticating this media. We're not exploring the possibilities of it. And usually that's going to mean very boring classes for kids. So in my video, I gave an example of saying a PDF, and another one with animation. And I have other animations with GeoGebra, just showing how you can explain advanced math of the pandemic to a lot of people. So that's the main idea of trying to be going beyond this idea of using, of making a movie just as the theater, as the drama theater was. So that's the metaphor I use. So I do think that more and more during the pandemic, we should be trying to build on our research of mathematics education. And we did very little of it. We just did emergence, but then there was more than emergence, but nobody was really looking at the papers and all that. And I would say that I did in this educational studies paper, educational studies in mathematics paper, expanded even more the idea of collective humans with media to talk about humans with media with homes. See, I'm here at my former dining room. I'm working partially at UNESP already, but this is now an office, a mosquito, things to kill mosquito, and, backpack and things like this. So I have a place to be communicating with you. That was not the case for most people in India, in Brazil, I can say for sure, and elsewhere, see, and maybe in other countries. So if we're going to have some kind of blended learning, we must have equity in homes in each country. So we must have an agenda that we do have homes with space like this or similar to this. My grown-up kids came back home during the pandemic, each one in one room. Who can have that? Very little people. So collective of humans with media, without domestication, with homes, and we should have school for all, mathematics education for all, which means home for all. Did I answer your question? I think it's my 5 minutes.
I think you did very well. And you do raise a very important point that we can call it balancing, we can call it equity, that when we think about remote online teaching and learning, then we must take into account what kind of situation different learners, different students have at home to be able to take part in it. Not everybody can have the kind of spaces that you or somebody like you would have available, but not everybody may have such a space available. So thank you, Marcelo, for bringing that very important perspective to this panel discussion. I will now go to Ravi. Ravi, from my neighboring country, I realized that I started the panel without introducing myself, which I will do it towards the end, but I'm from Pakistan. And Ravi is from India. Ravi, how do we achieve a balance between a classroom and remote online teaching in the context of large populations such as those in India? Ravi, I think you are on mute.
Yeah. Right. Thank you, Anju. I hope I'm audible now.
Yes, very clearly.
I'm Subramaniam, also known as Ravi. I work at the Homi Bhabha Center for Science Education, which is a part of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Mumbai, in India. So your question, Anjum, is very pertinent because like Pakistan and other countries in South Asia, we have a very large population which is, poor, not very little access to resources. Of course, if during the pandemic and of course, God forbid, were such a situation to repeat, we will all be forced, I guess, again to go into some kind of distance education. But this has been most people would describe it as a disaster. India had a very long period of lockdown of nearly 82 weeks. And now the rush is really to catch up on what everyone's terming as learning loss. Children are eager to get back to schools. Most of them have got back. Fortunately, the pandemic has receded, though there are pockets here and there where it's coming up, but people are not worried in general. And that's very good for education because children are back. In my neighborhood, the morning is very busy, bustling with parents and kids all setting out to school. And so this is good to see. Now, about your question, it's important to understand that India, like I guess many developing countries, some people would describe it as two Indias. There is an India which is very well resourced, which can access and afford all kinds of online education, perhaps not very, very expensive ones, but certainly there's a market for that. Parents are willing to spend money on these technologies, etc. And surely, that layer will benefit from blended instruction like in other places, in other countries of the world. But if we were to look at the vast majority in India, and they have access to very little resources, not just in terms of infrastructure, not just in terms of technology, but even in terms of the quality of education, the exposure, the training, the background, skills, and confidence of teachers who deal with them. And this is also something of an issue, and we've been struggling with this. Now, in such a context, I think, of course, students at, say, higher levels, higher education, university education, or higher secondary, if they're self-motivated and they have reasonable access to resources which are asynchronous, this is certainly going to help. And this is helping. One problem there is that much of the resources are not culturally appropriate. Our students cannot relate to resources which are available globally. It's very difficult for them to make a choice, with so much there. So curating resources, creating resources which are culturally appropriate is very essential at that level. And all of these can be blended in asynchronous modes very profitably, and it can percolate all the way down. So asynchronous modes are going to be important, even without pandemic situations. But otherwise, blending synchronous online teaching does not seem to me very feasible or practical at this moment, at least for the vast majority of the population in India, student population, who actually are very hungry for education. They don't have access to quality education. And this is not, there is promise that, somehow very good teaching can reach large numbers. I doubt whether that's really feasible. In some asynchronous modes, resources can reach, no doubt about that. But the whole of education delivery, I think, has to be the dominant mode has to be in-person education. Similarly, there's promises of personalized education. In fact, I just listened to an interview, excerpt from Byju's, which is now globally the biggest edtech company from India. It's a venture. It's something come out of India, and they say personalized instruction is going to make a big difference. Now, I don't know if this is really feasible again for very under-resourced groups and communities. And this is my view at present. And I think it's quite clear that we have to just strengthen our teachers who will go reach out to students in person. And there's no really shortcut to that if we want to bring up the quality of education. I hope I've answered your question, Ju. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. Yes, you have answered your one question, but you have raised many other questions, which I will come back to you in the next round of the session. So, Veronica, coming to you, what in the context of East Africa, in Tanzania, where you work, what are the opportunities that remote online teaching provides?
Thank you, Anjum. My name is Veronica. As you mentioned, I'm from Tanzania, currently working with Aga Khan schools. I would like to thank the organizers for this privilege to be part of the ICM. And what I would like to share is that there are a lot of opportunities that remote online learning sort of showed.
This is one example of different access. And it just happened, and that happened to many students, I think, in India, in Brazil, and even in Korea, I would say, in Pakistan.
So have we lost Veronica?
I think she froze, which
Yes.
means,
Yes.
yeah, she probably got a bad connection.
Okay, so what we will do is while she comes back online, we have time, I think, for our panel. We have raised many important points, and we still have about 10 minutes to go according to the timer that we have. So, Ravi, you raised some important questions about teacher readiness. And I think those questions also emerge from Huali's presentation when she said that, of course, there were new pedagogical strategies that needed because learners, students were used to using technology in a non-mathematical context, and the symbolic language of mathematics and its structure raised new questions of how technology could be used. So would any of the panel members like to elaborate on the need for teacher readiness in the context of remote online teaching, or even, all right, so Veronica is online.
Yes, maybe this is...
Veronica, all right, over to you, Veronica.
Apologies, and I think you can now all see, and our participants can see what happens in under-resourced areas when you're teaching. So yes, a great demonstration. So what I would like to say is there are opportunities for improvement. I agree with Ravi that maybe going fully online is something that is not easy for everyone. But as we came out, we found, I think, reflecting back on our learning, opportunities for improvement. And I would like to share two. One that Marcelo has already touched on is that we need to have meaningful ICT integration, even in face-to-face classes. And so we discovered that people who had that were more able to use media in a creative way. So I think that's an opportunity for improvement. As we come out, we should not abandon. We should not be like, oh, thank goodness, and we forget it. I think that's one way, an opportunity for improving our teaching with technology. The other affordance that we have is we do have virtual learning environments at our universities and learning management systems that are currently used mainly as repositories for asynchronous modes. And so what we as math educators could think of is how do we then integrate components of remote online learning, especially because some mature students cannot all attend classes. We also have very large classes. And so this could be an opportunity for improving our existing virtual learning environments, but a challenge for us who are digital immigrants, who are not natives, to think about how we can help the next generation who are very comfortable. And maybe this is where math teacher education programs can show the way by blending, having more remote online learning, and so giving the comfort to teachers to work with technology so that the next remote online learning should not be a disaster, but rather something that we are more comfortable. We do not wish it, but in case it comes, we should be better prepared. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. And indeed, you did give us a live flavor of the issues that remote online teaching and learning could present. So Fatima, how much time do we have? Do I have time to sum up?
7 minutes.
Yes. So I will go back to the question I had raised about teacher preparedness. And I wonder if any of the panel members would like to share their insights about how online teaching, whether remote online teaching, as we have described in our abstract, or asynchronous online teaching, what kind of issues does it raise for teacher preparation? Yes.
If I may, just briefly intervene,
yes,
not really to make a new point, but to endorse what Veronica just said. In fact, I think that's also a study which was done in a neighboring institute, the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, that a history of having used blended modes, integrated ICT approaches, which based on student productions, like Marcelo has pointed out. I think those are really important for integrating and blending technology. So I really agree with Veronica, and I also completely agree with the point that Veronica has made, which is about teacher education taking place in a blended mode with more of online thing, a point that, in fact, Marcelo has done work on this, he's written about it. And I think that's also a point which needs to be emphasized. Yeah, with me, I just.
Very good. Thank you, Ravi. Yes, Marcelo, I can see that you have raised your hand.
Yes, first of all, solidarity with Veronica and with everyone who, just have your internet connection. It's not only having good homes, but having good internet connection.
Good internet.
And in Brazil, the whole service was privatized. So the companies only want to go where people have a lot of money to pay for it. So you can see how this internet divide is even worse. So I think that we should think in terms of teacher education also about this divide, because there are teachers who live in neighborhoods who do not have internet access. So that's very important. But we should be discussing with teachers as researchers and have epistemological discussions with them that knowledge is produced also with media, and we should be discussing with them what the changes are. I've been doing a lot of that with the use of videos, the students and teachers producing videos, mathematical videos, and organized festivals for having this blended. But it's not going to be an easy one. We might have to do what Javi said. Maybe we should all go to school with good internet so we can access with equity to, for all the students. Thank you, Andrew, once more, and colleagues.
Thank you. Huali, do you want to make one final point before I sum up?
Yeah, I want to make one point that actually Marcelo made a comment in his video that is related to inequity issue as well. Teacher need to learn how students are facing with in terms of education or learning, and even situation that they need to solve for their living, something like that. So inequity issues really important that teachers need to understand.
Thank you.
And, yeah, okay.
Thank you. Veronica?
Just one word, and I think maybe work with what the students or the teachers have. That should be our media. So for example, if it's not Zoom, then maybe it could be WhatsApp or something. But let us try to bring in as many people as possible.
Colleagues, I would like to thank the panelists for the intensive preparation that you have done for the panel, for the videos that you have recorded and uploaded, for the rich discussion that we had today. And I would like to sum up as a chair, I would like to sum up the presentation that we made 3 or 4 key points which were running across the presentations. Of course, we realized that in the wake of the pandemic, the remote online teaching and the spread of the digital infrastructure opened up opportunities. But with that opportunities, we realized that there were new questions which are worthy of research. 3 questions came up very strongly. One is, how should teacher preparation take into account, especially mathematics teacher preparation and mathematics continuing teacher education take into account the new needs for the learners if they are going to use the software and the platforms that are available, technological platforms that are available. So teacher education, continuing education, and teacher preparation for mathematics teachers is one area that we discussed. The second one that we discussed is that when we moved, and in this panel, we see that there is a global spread. The panelists are right from Brazil right up to Seoul. But we may not necessarily have culturally relevant and culturally appropriate resources available to easily download and incorporate into teaching, because our mathematics education infrastructure was very much structured, especially at the high school level, at the K-12 school level, and for so that raises new questions for research and for universities, and also for other stakeholders who are responsible for preparing learning materials. The third point that came across very strongly, it came across in all the presentations, but Marcelo raised it very explicitly, is about equity. Equity for not just for the students who have good learning environment at home and have a secure place to learn, but others may not have it. The same applies also for teachers. Teachers may not have all the a good internet connection and everything available. So for education providers, if they want to use this approach as at a policy level to take it forward, then these equity issues need to be taken into account. With these remarks, I would like to, one other important point is that we all agree that the digital era, and Veronica called us, all of us, as digital immigrants. So the digital era is the future, and we must make use of the opportunity that opens up with the blended learning, with remote online learning, and with online synchronous and asynchronous learning. So those are opportunities that we really want to celebrate in mathematics teaching, learning, and mathematics education. So thank you, colleagues. I'm Anjum Halai, chair of this panel from the Aga Khan University in Pakistan. And I have worked for a long time in East Africa, and therefore, Veronica, it was a pleasure to see you from East Africa. So with that note, thank you very much. This video will now be uploaded on when we have the conference on 10th of July, 2022. Thank you. Good day again, colleagues. We are now live streaming in the ICM 2022. And I would like to thank the organizers of the International Congress of Mathematicians for having provided us this platform to raise and engage with some key issues in mathematics education. I would also like to thank my panelists who have worked intensively to table the key issues and provide this opportunity also to interact with their knowledge, and opportunities to us to interact with their knowledge, their cumulative wisdom, and their insights. Because we have time, Ravi, can I come to you? In your presentations, you raised some important points in the context of India, where students in the private sector, comparing the students in the private sector and the public sector. And you said that even in the low fee paying private sector, students are comparatively socioeconomically better off. So would you like to elaborate on the point that you made about the growing perception that teachers and in-person teaching is for the higher socioeconomic students, and IT, a fully IT-enabled teaching and learning is now for the low socioeconomic? That was a very key point and interesting point, and I wonder if you could elaborate it a bit more.
Thank you, Anjum. And first of all, Eid Mubarak to you. And,
thank you, Ravi. Thank you. I would also like to extend Eid Mubarak to all colleagues on the ICM, because we are celebrating Hajj and Eid today. Thank you, Ravi, for that, with those good wishes.
I think the question is an important one. That is, how does technology interact, particularly digital technologies, online teaching, and so on? How does it interact with the teacher's capacities, teacher readiness, teacher growth, and so on? And we need to worry about this question a little bit, because we see that the effective use of digital technologies, including online platforms, requires a very high level of skill, and I would say even creative imagination on the part of the teacher, who's able to successfully blend these things with in-person teaching. This kind of high level of skill, of course, is not widespread, at least among teachers in under-resourced countries. In fact, teacher capacities are really low. And that's the reason why we need to worry about this relationship of the technology and the teacher. I'd also like to mention that, in India now, we are busy getting back to, in-person education, and teachers are facing a lot of problems. There are new challenges. In fact, it seems to be the case that many students are finding it difficult to switch back and to tune into in-person teaching. It's not that they were tuned into online teaching. It's just that teachers are in a rush. They, putting in enormous efforts to recover what they call learning loss. But this recovery is turning out to be very difficult, because it appears that students have lost the habits of learning, the motivation and desire to learn in classroom settings, and this is turning out to be hard. In fact, this is even true at the university level. We've had university teachers saying that attendance is very low. Students are having difficulty. They don't have motivation to attend, even when they are available on the campus. So new challenges are emerging. In fact, we have decided in our forthcoming Teacher Association conference, the Math Teacher Association of India, which will be in September, to devote an entire theme to these new challenges in recovering from the pandemic, in terms of getting back to in-person learning. I wanted to mention that just to highlight the sort of difficulties that teachers will face in using these new technologies, and that's not going to be easy. However, technology in under-resourced context tends to be viewed in a very different way, as a sort of panacea, as a substitute for the lack of teacher capacities. So the idea is to push digital resources, even some kind of online teaching, remote teaching, and so on, to open out students to this, hoping that this will compensate or substitute for the unavailability of good teachers. And I think this is hugely problematic, and it can be potentially damaging, because it can push people towards technology, and can result in a neglect of enhancing teacher capacities, which is very, very sorely needed. And I want to mention, the sort of lack of teacher capacities and even availability of teachers in the Indian context can be staggering. In fact, we've had media reports about colleges and universities in more remote locations in India, not in the metropolises, which are very visible, generally better resourced and so on. But even if you move out into smaller towns in many states in India, particularly in the northern states, where there's a great desire for, there's a hunger for learning. The enrollment in university education, in colleges, as we call them, is very high. But the teachers are simply not there. In fact, the ratio of students to teachers can, approach 1,000 to 1 or even exceed that. So it's really staggering. And in such context, the push from technology can be potentially damaging. And I would like to mention one more thing here, which is that, technology is the educational technology in general is hooked onto other kinds of forces which are operating in society, larger economic forces which are driving digital technologies in other sectors, some things like what are called platform capitalism or capitalism driven by big data and the opportunities available and so on. So this creates an enormous, sort of enormously powerful forces which tend to take education in a certain direction. And you must couple with that the tendency in governments such as in India and in other countries to withdraw from the provision of public goods like health and education. So there's, the spending has hardly increased in education, in health. It's actually gone down over the years. And so this is in such a situation, we also need to pay attention to these larger economic forces which drive digitalization, coming from big data and so on, and which are simply looking for opening up sectors of the market, even within education, to see where some kind of profit can be made. And all this is somewhat worrying. And therefore, I think as educationists, we need to have this note of caution in thinking about how this is going to really, is it going to enhance teacher capacities for our societies as a whole, or is it going to push us back by a few years, where teachers, recovering those teacher capacities is going to be even more difficult going into the future. And I would also like to hear what the situation is or what concerns are about the impact of teachers of digital technologies and this interaction in other contexts, such as perhaps in Tanzania or in Pakistan or elsewhere. Over to you, Anjum.
Thank you, Ravi and colleagues. Another manifestation of online interaction is that because my internet is unstable, I'm not taking the liberty of opening my video. So you'll have to, colleagues will have to put up with just the photo up there. So Ravi, you raised some very important points about about mathematics teaching, learning, mathematics education, not just being in its own context, but has to be seen in the wider, broader social, economic context, particularly where capitalism is taking root and big companies, corporates are driving some of the key decisions about how large big data sets can be used through artificial intelligence. And there are companies coming up to propose solutions for education. And we have to be cautious how decision-making about education is driven for the well-being of those very people, the youth and the children for whom education is being delivered, and not for any other motives. So those are larger, broader, important questions also for mathematics education community. And if time permits, I will come back to you, Ravi, to elaborate on that. But and I would say you invited my comment with reference to Pakistan. I think we are grappling with some of the similar issues. There is a big question about where does provision of education reside? Is it the commitment of the government to provide basic social development facilities such as education and health? And could it be contracted out to the private sector? That's the question that you are raising, Ravi, and that's exactly the question that we are grappling with in Pakistan. And while we may think that, well, this is a forum about mathematics teaching and learning, but the point we are raising is mathematics teaching and learning, be it remote, online, be it fully online, or be it fully in person, cannot be devoid of the bigger questions that surround in the larger context. So, Veronica, coming to you, I know that you work in education in Tanzania, but I also know that Tanzania is part of the larger East African community, and so are your experiences. Would you like to elaborate on the concerns that arise and the possibilities that arise, of course, not just concerns, when we look at digital platforms for provision of access to education? What concerns arise if people begin to see technology as a substitute for good teachers? Because Ravi is saying that certainly not. The teacher is there to stay.
Thank you, Anjum, for this opportunity. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Yes. I'm also not turning on my camera, as everybody can know. So thank you for this opportunity. Thank you so much, Ravi, for elaborating on this. I think for East Africa, we have similar concerns. And actually, one of the reasons why there is a big pushback from teachers when we try to talk to them about integration of technology is because there is this misguided concept that technology can replace teachers. However, as you rightly pointed out, schools that can afford it will not do it because they know the vital part of teachers. But at the same time, technology can be seen as, well, if there's no teacher or there's somebody who is not so good, then the technology can do. And I think, in my opinion, the biggest concern, especially in mathematics education, is that these digital platforms are commercialized. Even if they are somehow subsidized and free of charge, one of the biggest concern is they are not very good pedagogically. And most of them, in my opinion, and of math educators, is all about content presentation. So, for example, in the case of Tanzania, we have some websites, but they only present mathematics in a very dry, memorizing way. And so students miss out on that part where you have math, the love of math, problem solving. And I think this is very dangerous because you would have students who then fall back and actually become less creative, less willing to solve problems, and ultimately, I think, not part of creating the content or creating digital content, but rather just the users. So in a way, we are not, I feel it could also be a deliberate move that they just want consumers. But even if I'm trying to be kind and saying it's not the initial plan, but this is what is actually coming up. So that is why I think this is an opportunity that we could look into these platforms and see how we can make them more interesting, maybe putting a problem-solving approach. But I agree with Ravi, you would still need the teacher at some point. You would need that in kind of blending. So if I see a very interesting question on a website and I have a solution and my friend has a different solution, then how do we work it out? So I think for me, that is the biggest problem, is that unfortunately the IT solution given for the less well-off is more of a traditional, less, I would say, mathematically less quality. So this is where we are wearing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Veronica. And we are approaching towards the closure of our time. But I think both you and Ravi and our other presenters, Marcelo and Lee, through their presentations have raised one very important point for us as mathematics teachers, mathematics educators, and mathematicians, that as the digital platforms, the digital technology, the big companies are arriving to help us, to enable us to improve access, to enable us to take the fruits of the digital environment, it raises new responsibilities for us. And those new responsibilities, I think Ravi and Veronica, you both pointed out that it is for the educators to ensure that the underpinning pedagogy, the underpinning teaching approaches in these digital, what is proposed through the digital platforms and online programs is a pedagogy which fulfills the philosophy that we would like to put forward as an enabling philosophy for the learners, whether it is through a problem-solving approach, whether it is through enabling the learners to make meaningful engagement with mathematics and conceptual learning. Literature also calls it principal learning or relational learning. It is a responsibility for us as mathematics educators to ensure that colleagues who are in the corporate sector, colleagues who are in the IT, we engage with them and we do not sit apart from them. With those notes, Ravi and Veronica, I'll invite you to make one last comment before we close this session.
Yes, I think the importance of having pedagogies which are inclusive, which are enabling, which sort of enable access to learners from disadvantaged backgrounds. I think that's really important, and we need. And digital tools are excellent in sort of getting students to engage. However, they, as we all sort of agree, they need to be in the hands of a good teacher. And I'd also like to flag, one of the things that is very striking to me is the changes which is happening in the space of digital resources, which were available, for instance, freely and which we depended on in under-resourced contexts quite a lot. To take the example of GeoGebra, I'd mentioned a couple of changes in this software. One is that, in the last version, they no longer allow you to save your own files on the hard disk, but you need to save them in the cloud, which is managed by GeoGebra, which makes it somewhat difficult, but not it's not impossible for we have teachers using it still by working out ways, even if they have poor connectivity and so on. And the other thing is that I noticed that the company itself, GeoGebra itself, was taken over by an Indian edtech company about 6 months ago. And so all of these trends, I hope they don't lead to a situation where it becomes more and more difficult to access digital technology for people who are poorly resourced. I mean, for those who are under-resourced. Yeah. Thank you, Anju.
Thank you, Ravi. Veronica, any last final comment?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity, Anjum, and thank you to the ICM organizers. I think as I ponder on all that we have talked about and what you have pointed out, moving ahead, it's the role of the mathematics educators and also the mathematicians to sort of ensure that we will have a next generation of people who will be inspired to take the field of mathematics from all parts of the world, especially the disadvantaged. So I hope that, to end on a hopeful note, that we will be able to inspire the next generation so that we'll have these kind of meetings which are more inclusive for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, colleagues. On behalf of the panel members, those who are here today, Ravi, Veronica, and presenters Marcelo and Quali, and on behalf of myself, I would like to now close this panel by thanking again ICM 2022. And I would like to especially thank our technical colleagues who have supported this and who are online with us today. And even before that, they have been immensely supportive in enabling us to take this conference in the virtual format. With that, I thank you all, and we close this panel.